The Deer Hunter, 1978, begins like a quiet wage, earned before it is spent. Its money path is not one of glittering wealth or visible transaction, but of endurance, the kind of financing that lives inside the hands of working people and the patience of a director who chose to build a long road through small, rough places. The first dollars that shaped this film moved slowly, like cold iron being heated, bent, and reforged. Each choice, each reel, each lens, each day of waiting reflected not an overflow of resources but a measured use of them, where every cost was felt in the bones of those creating it. Behind the surface of the story, where friends hunt deer in the steel-gray light of Pennsylvania and later find themselves lost in the jungles of another continent, there was a quieter drama playing out in offices and on set. The drama of keeping the project alive, of stretching what existed to match what was imagined. The production's financial journey began with an almost stubborn faith. Before the first camera rolled, before anyone could even be sure that this long, intense vision would find its audience, it had to find its footing with people willing to risk themselves on emotion alone. That faith was neither naive nor purely strategic. It was the kind that turns a script into a calling. The early period felt uncertain, shaped by meetings where belief outweighed evidence. Every creative risk mirrored a financial one. Those inside the circle could sense how every conversation about story was also, quietly, a conversation about money. How much risk they could absorb, how much waiting they could endure, how much trust they could extend to one another before the world outside noticed. Once shooting began, the balance between what appeared on screen and what surrounded it tightened like a wire. The setting demanded both scale and intimacy. The Steel Town sequences required the weight of realism. The factories, the taverns, the wedding, the hunting trips, all of it had to feel like the lived world of working Americans. But realism is expensive in its own way. It demands patience, location access, extras, time, and a crew that knows how to capture authenticity without artifice. Each of those elements drew from the same well of limited means. The team learned to move within invisible borders, finding value not in spending, but in precision. In the forest sequences, money took the shape of silence. The production could not afford indulgence. Every frame was weighed against how much longer the crew could stay, how many more days could be borrowed from the schedule before fatigue set in. The actors carried their characters not just as performances, but as reflections of the production's endurance. There was no safety net. The emotional strain of the narrative echoed the strain of making it. When the cameras turned to Vietnam, the entire financial tension deepened. To recreate that kind of chaos without the cushion of excess meant inventing new forms of resourcefulness. The heat, the smoke, the movement of extras, the sound of helicopters, all had to feel vast while remaining tightly controlled. Each illusion of abundance had to be built from careful, economical construction. The lived experience of money on this project was one of contradiction. On one hand, there was a sense of being part of something too large to fail, a film that would define careers and decades. On the other hand, there was the daily anxiety of logistics, the small calculations that define whether tomorrow's scene could even happen. Cast and crew often worked in spaces where uncertainty became a kind of shared language. They knew the difference between the glamour of filmmaking and the grind of surviving it. Every delay, every lost hour, every weather shift became a negotiation with reality. The film's soul depended on patience, and patience costs something unseen. For the director, the money story was inseparable from creative control. He understood that the true cost of vision is freedom, and freedom is expensive. The compromises that most productions accept, cuts, simplifications, stylistic shortcuts, were resisted here, but resistance itself has a price. To insist on long takes, on real emotion, on the haunting quiet between explosions, meant stretching what the budget could handle. Yet, those same risks gave the film its rare texture, a slow-burning authenticity that no larger investment could have bought. Every sacrifice behind the camera enriched what the audience later felt without knowing why. During post-production, the financial strain took on new form. Editing, scoring, and sound mixing are often where exhaustion meets doubt. The initial relief of finishing the shoot gave way to the practical task of finishing the film itself, where every hour in the studio, every spool of tape, every late-night revision demanded endurance. At this stage, the sense of money was no longer about bills or payments. It was about time. Time became the currency that mattered most, and every passing week carried its own quiet pressure. The team had poured themselves into something that had to justify all the tension and debt that had built up in silence. What surrounded the film's visible world, offices, ledgers, late meetings, and calls, was not glamorous but necessary. Producers juggled multiple fronts: creative demands, investor patience, distribution expectations. Each had to be managed so that the story remained intact. The film's success later made those struggles seem destined, but at the time, it was all improvisation and restraint. The emotional and sensory texture of that period can be imagined as a kind of exhaustion laced with hope. People believed they were part of something meaningful, yet belief does not pay for overtime. They pushed forward anyway, trading sleep for continuity, doubt for progress. For the cast, the financial atmosphere was both distant and immediate. Their contracts were handled elsewhere, but the limitations were felt everywhere. Days stretched longer, comforts were fewer, and the emotional intensity of the scenes was amplified by real fatigue. There is something almost sacred about that kind of commitment, where financial scarcity becomes part of performance. When the actors seemed broken, it was often because they were, and that truth gave the film its unique gravity. In many ways, the film's entire money journey reflected the story it told. It was about endurance, loss, and survival. The characters who leave home and return changed mirror the production team that began with faith and ended with something earned through pain. The film's internal finances, time, morale, stamina, rose and fell like the emotional tides of the narrative itself. Even the moments of beauty on screen were paid for with invisible costs. The wedding scene, long and immersive, required coordination, extras, music, and patience. It is remembered as celebratory, but for those behind the camera, it was a marathon of logistics. Each smile and dance hid the fatigue of long hours and constrained resources. The emotional economy of filmmaking often works in reversals. Joy purchased with hardship, clarity emerging from confusion, triumph shaped by failure. That dynamic pulsed through the entire process. The story being told on screen, a story of men broken by war and the cost of survival, was mirrored by the story off-screen, of artists strained by ambition and the limits of what could be afforded. Each carried a sense of debt that could never quite be repaid. When distribution neared, a different kind of pressure surfaced. What had once been about finishing became about presentation. Now the question was not only whether the film would resonate, but whether it would recoup, whether the long risk of endurance would translate into a return. For those who had given more than their hours, who had given faith, this stage was filled with a complex blend of pride and anxiety. They knew the work was powerful, but power does not always equal success. The industry's attention is fickle, and a film this raw could either be embraced or misunderstood. The days leading up to release felt like the silence before a verdict. The money that had once been borrowed, spent, or stretched now existed as emotion, embedded in the final cut. Every frame held the residue of decisions made under pressure. There was no sense of luxury, only of necessity. That necessity created discipline. It forced the filmmakers to find grace in constraint. They could not rely on spectacle or excess, only on human truth. That is where the real currency of cinema lies, when limited means produce limitless emotion. After completion, the weight of waiting returned. Payments, reports, and reconciliations moved slowly in the world of film. People who had long since moved on to new projects still carried the memory of this one. The financial arc did not end with applause. It faded gradually as accounts closed and obligations settled. But the emotional residue lingered. The project had consumed something from everyone involved, and even as returns trickled in, the true reward was the endurance itself. There is something almost paradoxical about how a film like this can both cost so much and feel so grounded. Its greatness lies not in opulence, but in restraint, not in abundance, but in care. The money that shaped it never felt like capital, it felt like courage. The producers managed, not through wealth, but through will, guiding the project through a terrain as treacherous as the one depicted on screen. Each delay, each near collapse, each recalibration became part of the invisible history of its making. For those who were there, the memory of the film's financial path would always be tied to human faces. The exhausted grip catching one more shot before dusk, the accountant balancing the week's totals with quiet dread, the actor sitting alone after a take, unsure whether the exhaustion was character or self. Money lived in those moments, not as numbers, but as choices. Every choice carried weight, and the accumulation of those weights became the film's emotional depth. As the film found its way into theaters and eventually into history, the early risk was transformed into legacy. What had once been a precarious, uncertain investment became a reference point for artistic bravery. Yet the people who lived through it knew how narrow the path had been. They remembered the near misses, the compromises avoided only by sheer will, the days when exhaustion blurred judgment. The success did not erase those memories. It illuminated them. In hindsight, the financial journey of this film reveals how art often lives at the edge of sustainability. Greatness rarely comes from comfort. It emerges from risk, from stretching too far, from refusing to settle for what is easy. The film's creators did not pursue wealth. They pursued truth, and in doing so, they redefined what cinematic worth could mean. The money that once dictated limits ended up revealing the measure of devotion behind the camera. In the quiet that follows any great work, after the checks have cleared and the offices have emptied, what remains is the memory of effort. Those who financed, those who worked, those who waited, all became part of a single continuum of faith. The process was neither efficient nor perfect, but it was alive. That aliveness is the truest wealth a film can have. What began as risk ended as proof that endurance itself has value. The project became a mirror of its own subject, a journey through hardship towards something that endures beyond calculation. The financial path of this film was not a straight line, but a series of circles, of giving, losing, regaining, and redefining. And somewhere within those circles, between fear and faith, exhaustion and clarity, art and survival met halfway. The result was a kind of equilibrium. No one walked away untouched. The experience changed how those involved understood cost, time, and meaning. They learned that a film's value is never measured by what it earns, but by what it asks of those who make it. And in this case, it asked everything. The production existed within a tension between enormity and control, its scale neither modest nor lavish, but carefully balanced between what could be afforded and what could be imagined. The ambition reached far beyond the size of its purse, but restraint was the unspoken discipline guiding every frame. On paper, it might have seemed like an ordinary drama set against extraordinary circumstances, but what was being built was closer to an odyssey. The crew stepped into it with a sense of gravity, aware that every location, every scene, every gesture of smoke and steel carried a price that went beyond finance. The story demanded weight, and weight is costly in ways unseen. In the Pennsylvania segments, the sense of scale was earned through presence rather than expense. The steel mills, the taverns, the small-town rituals were not dressed up with artifice, but observed with sincerity. The budget did not stretch to lavish reproductions or multiple controlled environments, so the production leaned on authenticity. Real locations, lived-in textures, natural light, all became part of an aesthetic that mirrored financial necessity. The absence of polish turned into a strength, lending the film its raw texture. The steel plant glowed like a furnace, not because of extravagant design, but because the environment itself carried that industrial poetry. What might have been a limitation elsewhere became here a statement of truth. The wedding scene tested the limits of endurance. It demanded coordination on a scale disproportionate to the rest of the film, with dozens of extras, long stretches of shooting, music, dancing, and emotion layered over exhaustion. It felt both monumental and intimate, a reflection of the project itself. Time was the invisible currency. Time was the invisible currency. Each hour spent capturing joy risked compressing later schedules, yet no one wanted to rush it. The director's insistence on immersion, on letting the camera linger long enough for the world to feel lived, strained the daily budgets. The production team learned to treat each take as an investment in the film's lasting power. What emerged was not excess, but authenticity, achieved through careful rationing of means. When the story left the steel town and entered the wilderness, the scale shifted from collective to elemental. The mountain landscapes demanded travel, coordination, and patience. Nature dictated pace more than planning did. The production's reach exceeded what its resources comfortably allowed, yet the vastness of the setting required no embellishment. The budget's restraint became invisible. The land provided grandeur for free. Still, every remote location came with logistical strain, weather, transport fatigue. The size of the crew shrank, focus tightened, and every movement carried more weight. These were days of stripped-down filmmaking, where equipment had to earn its place and every extra hand mattered. By the time the narrative turned toward war, the production had grown heavier with ambition. The jungle scenes, dense with chaos and symbolism, needed to feel real without the machinery of large-scale spectacle. There were no endless reserves of funding to simulate destruction, so ingenuity replaced opulence. The crew built worlds from fragments, using space and sound to imply scale. Smoke, movement, and editing filled the gaps that money could not. What resulted was a portrayal of enormity achieved through restraint, a lesson in how limitation can create intensity. The absence of abundance forced focus on a human faces, where the real drama lived. The actors felt the pressure as much as the producers. Long days, shifting climates, unpredictable conditions, all formed part of the texture of the work. There was no comfort of endless retakes or expansive margins. Every performance was delivered within the awareness that time was finite. The exhaustion visible on screen came not from performance alone, but from lived exertion. It was as though the boundaries of budget had merged with the emotional contours of the story. To survive the shoot was to inhabit its themes. In practical terms, the production scale demanded constant recalibration. Scenes were rewritten, reimagined, or compressed to align with what was feasible. Equipment lists were shortened, and shooting days restructured. The creative department learned to think in terms of endurance rather than extravagance. The cinematography had to capture breadth with efficiency, framing landscapes that could double for more elaborate backdrops, using light and shadow to stretch perception. The result was a film that felt larger than its means, expansive yet grounded. Coordination became the invisible art of the set. Every day required synchronization between departments, all aware that there was little room for error. The mood oscillated between urgency and stillness. When progress flowed, the energy lifted the crew. When delays struck, frustration deepened. The scale of the production was not measured in size alone, but in intensity. Each sequence carried the weight of multiple disciplines working in fragile harmony. Sound, light, costume, movement, each borrowing from the same limited reservoir of time and energy. The set had its own economy of spirit. Food, rest, and morale were as vital as any currency. When the schedule compressed, tempers and fatigue rose. Yet those moments also produced a strange camaraderie. The knowledge that everyone was giving beyond capacity forged a collective pride. Even when the workday ended, no one truly stopped. The project had entered their bloodstreams. Scale, for them, was not about grandeur, but about depth, about how far into themselves they had to reach to keep going. As the film moved closer to completion, its internal architecture became clear. It had the heart of an epic built on the shoulders of a modest operation. Each constraint had carved its shape. The limited budget forced concentration on essentials: story, performance, atmosphere. What could have been a sprawling war picture became instead a meditation on loss, friendship, and return. The absence of excess allowed emotion to breathe. Where another film might have drowned in spectacle, this one survived through sincerity. During the final weeks, fatigue became a currency of its own. Crew members counted sleep in fragments, meals in minutes. There were times when it felt as though the film was devouring its makers. Yet that exhaustion gave the finished product its pulse. Every frame carried the sweat of its creation, the sense that nothing here came easy. Even small victories, a clean take, a steady shot, a quiet scene intact despite chaos, were treasured. The budget might have been stretched, but morale endured through the belief that what they were making mattered. Behind the camera, the producers managed the scale like conductors, keeping a fragile symphony in tune. They balanced creative insistence against financial gravity, protecting vision while preventing collapse. There was no room for indulgence, but there was faith that discipline could achieve grandeur. The conversations were often quiet, practical, and tense. How to cover one more day, how to shift equipment without delay, how to keep spirits intact when exhaustion blurred focus. These were not heroic gestures, but small acts of preservation. The survival of the production itself became a triumph. The editing suite later revealed the payoff of those decisions. The raw footage, though born from constraint, contained surprising richness. The rhythm of the shots, the lingering patience of the camera, the realness of the environments, all gave the film its immersive scale. The absence of lavish resources became indistinguishable from artistic intent. The editor worked like a sculptor, revealing the shape already hidden within the material. The financial discipline had given the film a unity of tone, a coherence that money cannot buy. As completion neared, the team could finally step back and see what they had built. The experience of making it had been both punishing and sacred. No one emerged unchanged. They had discovered that a film's true scale lies not in the expanse of its budget, but in the honesty of its execution. The production had created a world that felt immense because it was lived, not manufactured. The factory smoke, the mountain fog, the echoing church bells, all spoke of effort transmuted into art. Reflecting on those months, many would later describe them as both the hardest and the most meaningful of their careers. The film's scale had been achieved through compression, through the intensity of human focus sustained under pressure. There were no wasted shots, no ornamental gestures. Every resource had been forced to justify itself. That necessity became a kind of purity. Within its limitations, the production found freedom, because constraint had stripped away everything but purpose. Even in moments of near collapse, when days overran and tempers flared, the sense of shared purpose prevented disintegration. The crew's dedication became a substitute for wealth. The film's ambition might have exceeded its resources, but it never exceeded their belief. That belief kept the machinery moving, even when the machinery itself felt fragile. By the end, the production had achieved a balance that few manage, a work that looked vast but was built from scarcity. The feeling on set, from first shot to last, was one of controlled desperation turning into grace. The scale was emotional, not financial. The grandeur came from honesty, not extravagance. What appeared to be a large, sweeping narrative was, in truth, the cumulative effect of small, disciplined decisions taken under pressure. The beauty of it lay in the alignment between necessity and vision, the way every limitation sharpened the image instead of dulling it. When the final wrap came, silence replaced the constant hum of work. The crew stood among the remnants of their effort, sets half dismantled, equipment boxed, the echo of long days still in the air. They understood that what they had made could not have existed under any other conditions. The strain, the scarcity, the delicate balance between ambition and survival had become part of the film's soul. The budget had shaped not only what was possible, but what was true. The production story is remembered as a study in endurance disguised as art. Its scale, though modest by industrial standards, carried the weight of an epic because everyone involved gave more than they had. The film remains proof that grandeur can be born from restraint, that scarcity can deepen rather than diminish meaning. In its quiet way, the production transformed its limits into its language. Every constraint became part of its heartbeat, every decision a testament to the belief that authenticity is the highest form of wealth. The financing of the film began like the slow drawing of breath before a long dive, each stage dependent on timing, persuasion, and endurance rather than abundance. Early confidence was thin, almost tentative, built on personal conviction rather than clear guarantees. Those first steps toward funding were marked by private negotiations, small advances of faith, and the quiet tension that comes when imagination moves faster than resources. The people closest to the project felt this imbalance constantly, ideas expanding faster than the capacity to pay for them. The rhythm of cash flow was irregular, unpredictable, a pulse that sometimes strengthened and sometimes nearly stopped. Yet, within that uncertainty, a peculiar determination formed, the kind that drives people to continue not because it is easy, but because stopping would betray the effort already made. At the beginning, support arrived in fragments. There were moments when enthusiasm filled the room, only to be followed by weeks of silence. Those handling the business side of the film learned to read moods as much as numbers, to sense when trust was strong enough to push forward another inch. Early faith came from individuals rather than institutions, people who believed not in guaranteed return, but in emotional necessity. They saw that the story demanded telling, even if it required patience that stretched their limits. These early believers moved ahead with little more than intuition, covering gaps and holding steady until later confidence arrived. Once the project advanced to pre-production, the tone shifted. Paper promises had to become tangible actions. Each department required something. Locations needed deposits, cast needed contracts, crew needed schedules, and all of it depended on the flow of money arriving in time. There were days when funds cleared just before commitments were due, a kind of dance that demanded perfect timing. The producers developed a rhythm of waiting, calling, confirming, then waiting again. It became a way of life. They learned to measure progress not by grand milestones, but by the relief of a single payment arriving before panic set in. On set, the rhythm of financing was felt even by those who had no part in managing it. Crew members could sense the difference between days when support was secure and days when everyone moved a little quieter, cautious about waste. Morale followed that pulse. When timing aligned and paydays landed as promised, energy rose. When delays appeared, tension built silently, the way humidity builds before a storm. The film's atmosphere, its realism, its strain, its emotion, was shaped as much by these unseen financial tides as by artistic intention. The money itself became part of the storytelling, an invisible participant influencing pace, patience, and morale. During the long shoot, confidence grew unevenly. Some supporters increased their backing once they saw the footage. Others hesitated, waiting to gauge response. Late-stage commitments often arrived out of momentum rather than design. As the film's shape became clearer, the aura around it shifted. The story's intensity began to draw new interest, but each new contribution came with conditions, schedules, and expectations that required fresh negotiation. The financing remained a living thing, breathing, adapting, and occasionally faltering. There was no single breakthrough moment, only a continuous effort to stay balanced while carrying something far heavier than anyone had planned. The crew, aware of this fragile structure, adjusted instinctively. They learned to stretch supplies, to make do with less, to move quickly when days of certainty were rare. There was no guarantee that tomorrow's work would have the same cushion as today's, so they treated each completed scene as a quiet victory. The director understood that timing shaped not only the production, but the psychology of everyone involved. He often filmed in bursts of intensity when confidence was high, capitalizing on momentum before reality caught up. Then, During the slower intervals of waiting, he reevaluated, planned, conserved. This alternation between rush and stillness gave the film its rhythm, a cadence of effort that mirrored the characters' own journeys. When the setting shifted from small-town life to the war-torn jungle, the strain deepened. New locations meant new logistics, and with them, new demands on cash flow. Transportation, accommodation, and local arrangements expanded the timeline of spending. The production entered a phase where even minor delays could trigger chain reactions. Every day of waiting carried costs, and each cost rippled outward, tightening the line of credit that held everything together. Those managing the accounts lived in a state of quiet calculation, balancing promises against exhaustion. The sense of risk was constant but contained. Everyone knew that one late payment could undo months of progress. Yet the work continued as if nothing could touch it. For the director and key cast, this instability created an emotional tension that fused with the story itself. The characters they portrayed, men navigating chaos, isolation, and loss, reflected their lived experience of a production caught between hope and uncertainty. Waiting for funds became like waiting for rescue. Each confirmation felt like survival. The rhythm of support was unpredictable, but each renewed inflow reignited faith. In those moments, the exhaustion of waiting transformed into gratitude for continuation. The film advanced in waves, each one uncertain but unstoppable. The timing of money shaped more than logistics. It influenced tone. During stretches when funding was lean, the production leaned into minimalism, using stillness and silence as artistic tools. When support flowed more freely, sequences expanded, confidence widening the lens. The result was a film that felt alternately intimate and immense, a reflection of how the financial pulse had guided the creative one. The uneven rhythm of financing created a kind of organic pacing, one that no schedule could have planned, but which ultimately defined the film's atmosphere. Behind the scenes, those closest to the financial negotiations endured a quieter story of their own. They carried the burden of appearing calm while juggling uncertainties too delicate to share. Each call for additional support carried its own emotional weight. Convincing backers to hold faith required diplomacy, timing, and empathy. They learned to speak in reassurances that even they struggled to believe. Their language became one of patience. Tomorrow, next week, soon. Yet despite the strain, they protected the creative core from panic. The cast and crew sensed tension but never lost momentum, because someone was always quietly holding the structure together. As shooting neared completion, the rhythm of inflow began to stabilize, though the scars of earlier uncertainty remained. Delays had reshaped schedules, exhausted reserves, and tested loyalties. What emerged was a collective understanding that endurance itself was the greatest resource. The team had become experts at adaptation. They knew how to pivot, how to shrink or expand, depending on what the day allowed. This flexibility became their method of survival. It was not efficiency born of wealth, but of necessity. The sense of shared struggle created a unity that no budget could buy. When the production entered post, another phase of waiting began. Editing rooms are quiet spaces, and quiet magnifies worry. The cost of finishing sound, score, assembly arrived in small bursts of invoices and approvals. Supporters who had funded the adventure now watched from a distance, their confidence alternating between pride and apprehension. The producers once again became translators between worlds, creative urgency and financial caution. The cash flow that had once determined survival now determined completion. Timing mattered more than ever. A late payment could mean halted editing, a delayed release, a missed window of opportunity. Each small success, each approved payment, each cleared account felt like a breath released after holding it too long. The rhythm of financing shaped not only the structure of the film, but the memories of those who made it. Crew members would later recall the pattern of tension and relief more vividly than the numbers themselves. They remembered nights spent calculating how long supplies would last, days when sudden good news lifted morale like sunlight breaking through fog. They remembered how, against all odds, the film continued. One transfer, one favor, one miracle at a time. That lived rhythm of scarcity and endurance became inseparable from their sense of accomplishment. Even after the picture locked, timing continued to haunt the project. Payments took months to settle. Accounts lingered unresolved, and the slow machinery of film finance crept toward closure. Those who had carried the burden of arranging and waiting found themselves in a strange limbo, unable to celebrate fully until every obligation had been met. The experience left them marked by patience, their understanding of time permanently altered. They had learned that in filmmaking, money does not move at the pace of creativity. It lags, resists, and tests endurance. The cast, removed from those final reconciliations, felt a different rhythm. For them, the film had already transformed into memory, but they carried traces of the uncertainty that had surrounded its making. When they spoke about it later, they described not just scenes or characters, but moods. The tension of days when continuation was uncertain, the relief when it wasn't. They had lived through a process that taught them the fragility of art, how easily it could have vanished had timing tilted another way. The financiers, reflecting later, saw their own journey mirrored in the film's themes. They had invested not just capital, but faith during periods when faith seemed irrational. Their reward was not immediate but eventual, and its shape was emotional rather than financial. They had waited, adjusted, and endured, and in doing so, they had participated in a story about endurance itself. The sense of waiting that defined the narrative was the same one that had defined their experience behind it. When the final receipts were tallied and the last balances closed, the memory of timing lingered. It had not been a clean or linear path. It had been a mosaic of improvisations. The flow of funds had followed its own unpredictable logic, and yet, somehow, it had been enough. The film existed against all odds because people chose to continue when logic said stop. The result was a piece of work that carried within it the rhythm of its own creation, a pulse of waiting, of sudden motion, of long silences punctuated by bursts of life. Years later, those who had been there would still speak of that rhythm. They would remember how each stage of financing carried its own emotional signature. Early faith marked by nervous hope, mid-phase chaos marked by exhaustion, final completion marked by disbelief. They would remember how every delay had taught them something about endurance, and how every arrival of funds had felt like salvation. The experience had reshaped their understanding of what it means to sustain a vision through uncertainty. In the end, the financing of the film was less a sequence of transactions than a living drama of trust, timing, and resolve. It revealed how creation often depends not on abundance, but on persistence, the will to keep moving even when the next step is unclear. The people who carried that will, from first meeting to final frame, discovered that patience itself can be a form of capital. And when the film finally reached its audience, what they saw on screen, the endurance, the quiet despair, the flashes of grace, was not just fiction but the echo of the long, uneven rhythm that had carried it into existence. Ambition always begins larger than permission. The scope of this project started as something immense, a meditation on war, friendship, and a fracture of the human soul, but it had to be carried within the limits of what could be built and sustained. The creative team faced the quiet arithmetic of art. How much to attempt, how much to restrain, how to protect emotion without exhausting the means that made it possible. Every decision, from script to final frame, was measured against the invisible weight of what it would cost, not in money alone, but in time, stamina, and coordination. What they attempted was nothing short of vast. What they endured to realize, it was a study in control. The earliest drafts had imagined an even broader world. The story stretched outward, envisioning scenes of war and return, of industrial life and wilderness, each demanding its own language and scale. As production approached, the budget imposed silence on those impulses. Scenes were trimmed, ideas compressed, not as defeat, but as design. The director understood that limitation sharpens intent. Instead of sprawling geography, he chose depth. Instead of endless battles, he chose the slow burn of memory. The constraints imposed by budget became the architecture of meaning. The camera would stay closer, the silences longer, the gestures heavier. What could not be afforded would instead be implied. An implication, done right, costs nothing and reveals everything. That logic of restraint defined the tone. The long wedding sequence, once a logistical challenge, became a statement of abundance achieved without opulence. Every face, every dance, every note of music replaced what might have been spent on spectacle. The creative scope narrowed to human experience, the laughter, the fatigue, the sweat, and in doing so, it found its true power. The decision to invest so much time and patience into this single event was both artistic and financial strategy. Show depth once, and its echo sustains the rest. When the story left the steel town, the trade-offs grew sharper. The war scenes required invention rather than expenditure. Large-scale battles became fragments of chaos captured through close framing, editing, and sound. The jungle was less a battlefield than a fever dream. Limited resources forced the director to abandon literalism and embrace abstraction. Explosions and movement were orchestrated for emotional truth rather than technical completeness. This restraint, born of necessity, gave the film its haunting quality. Violence as impression rather than choreography, confusion as structure rather than error. Each creative department practiced its own form of minimalism. The production design team learned to reuse, disguise, and repurpose. What appeared as new spaces were often reconfigured remnants, rearranged under fresh light. Costume design relied on texture more than quantity, aging fabrics to tell stories that money could not. Sound was used like a scalpel, precise, deliberate, selective. The score, sparse and haunting, became a bridge between what could be shown and what could not. Every discipline translated scarcity into style. Behind those aesthetic choices was the constant dialogue between vision and practicality. The director's insistence on emotional authenticity often collided with the producer's reminders of budgetary gravity. Arguments were not about extravagance, but about priorities, what moments could be expanded and which had to be sacrificed. The crew became accustomed to quiet compromises. Some sequences were shortened before they were ever shot. Others were merged, rewritten, or relocated to fit within what the day allowed. The editing room later became the site where those trade-offs were transformed into rhythm. What might have been missing became part of the film's breathing pattern. The pauses, the ellipses, the unspoken griefs. Constraint also influenced casting and performance. The actors knew that this film was built not on technical tricks, but on endurance. Their work would depend on patience and truth rather than rehearsal and repetition. The lack of luxury became a source of intensity. Scenes were filmed under real fatigue, real weather, real limitation. The performances bore that weight. Emotion came raw, unrefined, because the process itself was stripped of excess. The creative scope contracted around authenticity. The result was not smaller art, but deeper art. Each production day reflected an equilibrium between risk and containment. The director reached for emotional scale, but the schedule pulled downward. Sometimes that friction produced sparks, moments where limitation forced invention. A missed sunrise meant a dusk scene reborn in shadow. A lost location forced intimacy that proved more powerful than grandeur. The creative scope became a living negotiation between what was dreamed and what could be delivered. The film's realism was the byproduct of these adjustments. Crew members felt the same pattern. Every department carried both pride and frustration. There were constant reminders that dreams have edges, that patience must replace excess. Yet in that containment, a unity formed. Everyone understood the logic of the budget, not as oppression, but as necessity. The director communicated through the language of purpose. What mattered most must survive. This gave the team a strange freedom. When everything unnecessary fell away, what remained was pure intent. During post-production, this logic reached its clearest form. Editing revealed how much power had been gained through subtraction. Sequences once feared incomplete now carried tension through silence. Gaps became emotional bridges. The absence of constant score, the pauses between dialogue, the empty spaces of landscape, all testified to a confidence in restraint. The creative team realized they had built something that looked larger than it was, not through illusion, but through proportion. By refusing to chase fullness, they found resonance. At every stage, choices were guided by an understanding of weight. The director spoke often, not of scenes, but of balance, how much the film could bear before collapsing under its own seriousness. That sense of proportion governed even small details. How long the camera could linger before sentiment turned indulgent. How much color could appear before realism broke. The logic of the budget had taught discipline, and discipline became aesthetic integrity. The result was a film that felt expansive but controlled, emotional but never chaotic. The creative constraints also shaped the pacing of the narrative. Long takes replaced montages, letting moments unfold naturally. The audience was made to feel time passing, just as the crew had felt it during production. That decision, part artistic, part financial, anchored the film's tone. By avoiding constant movement, the film became meditative. Stillness became its wealth. The ambition remained enormous, but its expression was inward. What began as a story about war widened into a reflection on human endurance. The budget limited what could be shown, but not what could be felt. The absence of spectacle drew attention to interior life. Viewers later spoke of the film's grandeur, unaware that grandeur had been achieved through subtraction. The creative scope had contracted until only essence remained. Even the lighting choices reflected the same restraint. Natural light dominated. Artificial setups were used sparingly. This saved both time and money, but also gave the film its muted, haunting tone. Shadows became emotional architecture. The cinematographer learned to read the sky as budget. Every shift of cloud determined mood. The decision to shoot within those limitations produced a visual poetry impossible to buy. Throughout, the director maintained an almost spiritual belief in the discipline of limits. He saw the budget not as an adversary, but as a compass. It pointed always toward the essential. When a location proved too costly, he searched for a simpler one and discovered new layers of meaning. When a planned sequence proved unfeasible, he replaced it with silence. The constraints became collaborators, whispering what could be lost without harm. That trust in reduction became the film's signature. By the end, what the film achieved was paradoxical, a sense of magnitude emerging from austerity. Its tone, somber, patient, elemental, was born directly from its financial conditions. The audience experienced a vast emotional journey, but the machinery behind it was small, deliberate, and exacting. Every creative choice had passed through the sieve of practicality, and what remained was distilled truth. In the quiet after the final cut, the team understood that their greatest success was not surviving the budget, but transcending it. The film had proven that constraint could refine rather than reduce, that a limited framework could produce limitless resonance. The creative scope had been bounded by necessity, but within those bounds, the filmmakers had found everything they needed. The result was a work of precision disguised as sprawl, of intimacy mistaken for spectacle. The balance between ambition and reality had not been easy. It demanded patience, humility, and surrender. But that surrender revealed a deeper mastery, the ability to listen to what the film wanted rather than forcing it to obey. The logic of the budget had become the logic of the story. Endurance, loss, discipline, survival. The production ended with nothing wasted and nothing missing. Its creative scope had been both narrow and infinite, held together by the quiet courage to make less feel like more. Awareness began as a whisper, carried from one conversation to another before the first posters were printed. The film did not announce itself with volume, but with gravity, moving slowly into the public eye through tone rather than noise. Its marketing was less a campaign than a gathering of mood, an atmosphere cultivated by those who had lived through its making. The people behind it understood that the story's weight could not be sold through spectacle. It had to be felt before it was seen. The first images released to the world were deliberate in their restraint. Faces caught in half-light, landscapes heavy with silence, fragments that hinted at experience rather than explained it. The approach was not about convincing, but about preparing, teaching the audience how to listen. The timing of its presentation mattered. The season of release carried its own tension, crowded schedules, competing voices, but the film arrived like an interruption. It didn't seek to outshine others. It sought to outlast them. The first viewers approached with caution, uncertain of what they would encounter. Early screenings were quiet, measured, almost reverent. Word of mouth became the true currency of awareness. Those who saw it left changed, not in the way of excitement, but in the way of contemplation. They spoke less about story and more about experience, and their tone spread further than any advertisement could. The film's identity began to form in those private retellings. Inside the production offices, the team watched this slow awakening with both pride and unease. Marketing had been a negotiation from the start. There were discussions about how much to reveal, how much to protect. The producers knew that overstating the film's scale could mislead the audience, setting expectations it never intended to meet. Yet underselling risked invisibility. The chosen strategy walked a fragile line between mystery and invitation. They leaned on imagery rather than words, on the unspoken weight of the subject rather than the glamour of its cast. The campaign suggested more than it showed, trusting that curiosity would fill the gaps. For those handling the film's introduction to the world, every choice carried the memory of how difficult it had been to make. They wanted the marketing to honor that effort, to reflect sincerity rather than gloss. That sincerity became the brand. Instead of positioning the film as a conventional drama, they presented it as an emotional reckoning. The tone was sober, the language restrained, the visuals austere. Each poster, each trailer, each article carried the same texture of endurance that defined the production itself. When the first reviews appeared, they arrived like small tremors. Critics grasped that something rare had been attempted. They described not just what they saw, but what they felt. The film's quiet approach created a contrast to the louder works surrounding it. Viewers spoke of its length, its patience, its refusal to hurry. What some found demanding, others found transformative. The marketing team understood that this divide was not weakness, it was identity. The film's awareness would grow not through universal appeal, but through conviction. Those who loved it would defend it fiercely, and their passion would carry it forward. Internally, the sense of anticipation was complex. The cast, scattered across new projects, heard of its reception in fragments. Letters, phone calls, whispered reports. For many, the journey back into public attention felt surreal. They remembered the exhaustion of the shoot, the uncertainty of financing, and now saw the work refracted through praise and critique. Their private sacrifices were being translated into headlines, their moments of vulnerability reduced to adjectives. It was both rewarding and disorienting. The marketing amplified what they had once lived, turning pain into art, art into commodity. That transformation carried both pride and unease. The producers, for their part, measured success in smaller increments. Each mention in a major publication, each new screening confirmed that the film had not vanished into obscurity. They watched for signs of connection, not numbers. A letter from a critic, a full theater in a quiet town, an unexpected encore. These became their indicators of momentum. The chatter was subdued but steady. The film's reach extended through resonance, not repetition. The audience's first impressions unfolded gradually. People approached it not as entertainment, but as encounter. Many left theaters in silence, as if words would cheapen what they had witnessed. That silence itself became marketing. In coffee shops and living rooms, the film's reputation grew as something to endure rather than simply watch. Viewers warned others of its heaviness, yet those warnings carried fascination. Curiosity grew around the idea of a film that demanded so much stillness. The marketing materials, minimal and solemn, seemed to align perfectly with this perception, reinforcing the notion that what awaited was not a show, but an experience. For those within the company handling distribution and promotion, this slow burn tested patience. They were accustomed to sharper trajectories, big openings, fast returns, but this was different. The film's audience expanded laterally rather than explosively, moving through circles of influence rather than mass appeal. Each week brought small gains instead of sudden spikes. Yet there was a sense that beneath the surface, something enduring was taking shape. Viewers were not forgetting it once they left the theater. They were carrying it. That permanence, though less visible, was far more powerful. The advertising evolved subtly over time. As recognition grew, so did confidence. The later campaigns leaned into the emotional core, showing glimpses of the film's most haunting moments, but never revealing resolution. Music was used sparingly, images chosen for texture rather than narrative clarity. The team had learned that the film's power came from tension, the space between what was promised and what was delivered. The marketing mirrored that restraint, keeping faith with the film's tone rather than chasing trends. Inside the studio, the mood oscillated between cautious optimism and quiet awe. Everyone sensed that they were witnessing the birth of something lasting. The film's awareness campaign had moved from external persuasion to internal belief. Even those who had doubted its marketability now spoke of its gravity. The conversations shifted from whether it would succeed to how best to sustain its life. That shift in tone was itself a signal. The film had transcended the fragile stage of introduction. The actors felt the ripple of awareness in unexpected ways. Invitations arrived for interviews and retrospectives, but the tone of questioning was different, less about fame, more about process, about meaning. They found themselves speaking not of technique, but of emotion, recounting the sense of fatigue, faith, and collaboration that had defined the shoot. Their memories became part of the film's myth, woven into its public story. In a sense, the marketing extended beyond posters and press. It lived through these personal narratives, through every person who spoke of what it felt like to be part of something that demanded so much. As word of mouth continued to build, the studio began to notice an unusual pattern: repeat viewings. People returned, bringing others. The marketing department adjusted quietly, allowing this organic energy to lead. Rather than saturate media space, they emphasized presence. Select theaters, curated festivals, limited releases that created a sense of exclusivity. The strategy of scarcity mirrored the film's own production values. Less exposure, more impact. Each showing became an event, each conversation a continuation of the story. The press coverage shifted from curiosity to reverence. Journalists began describing the film not as a product, but as a phenomenon, a work that had managed to capture a moment in cultural consciousness. That tone of respect fed back into awareness. Suddenly, the film was everywhere, not through ubiquity, but through significance. Every mention felt earned. The film's journey from obscurity to recognition became its own narrative arc, a parallel to the story it told. Behind the scenes, those who had shepherded its promotion were exhausted, but fulfilled. They had managed to translate an unmarketable film into a cultural event by trusting patience over pressure. The awareness campaign had required faith equal to the faith that made the film itself. They had learned that silence can speak louder than slogans, that restraint can build intrigue more effectively than noise. The creative and financial teams, once divided by necessity, now shared pride in the same outcome: endurance rewarded. As months passed, the awareness solidified into legacy. The film no longer needed to be sold. It was being remembered. The early whispers had grown into a lasting hum. Viewers who had once hesitated now spoke of it as essential, a reference point for seriousness and courage in filmmaking. The marketing had long ended, but its design, a quiet, consistent, emotionally truthful presentation, continued to echo through retrospectives and discussions. What had begun as fragile anticipation had become cultural permanence. The people who had built that awareness understood, perhaps better than anyone, that they had achieved it not through invention, but through alignment. They had listened to the film, to its mood, its humility, its weight, and allowed those qualities to dictate how it met the world. The spin to reach was never about outpacing others. It was about matching tone with audience expectation. In doing so, they created not just recognition, but reverence. The awareness was never loud, but it was deep, and that depth is what endures. The opening weekend arrived like an exhale after years of holding breath. The team that had carried the film through exhaustion and doubt now stood at the edge of public judgment, aware that no amount of preparation could dictate how the world would respond. The first screenings were less celebrations than vigils. Quiet rooms filled with faces uncertain of what they were about to feel. In those darkened theaters, the months of labor, the delicate coordination of money and will, resolved into silence and light. The film began, and for a few hours, everything else, the fatigue, the waiting, the negotiations, fell away. The only measure that mattered now was the stillness of the audience. When the lights rose, the temperature of the room changed. People did not rush out. They lingered. Some spoke softly. Others didn't speak at all. That hesitation was the first sign, the unquantifiable signal that the work had connected on a level deeper than approval. The team waiting outside the theater sensed it immediately. They looked for faces, for gestures, for anything that could tell them what words could not. The first weekend was not about numbers or praise. It was about survival, whether the story they had built from endurance would find endurance in others. Inside the offices, where phones waited to ring and reports trickled in, the mood oscillated between calm and contained panic. Each hour brought fragments of news, early impressions, half-formed opinions. There was relief that the film had arrived intact, that no logistical collapse had marred its release. Yet beneath that relief ran the old current of anxiety. Would audiences stay? Would they understand? The producers, who had lived through every tight decision, now faced the one part of the process they could not control: response. They waited as they had always waited, but this time the waiting was public. The director, distant from the noise, carried his own quiet. He had spent years fighting to keep the film pure, to protect its silences and its slow pace. Now he had to trust that the same patience would find echo in strangers. Opening weekend for him was not an event, but a reckoning. When he heard that people were leaving the theater subdued, reflective, even shaken, he understood that something essential had survived translation. The film was heavy, and it had landed heavily. For the actors, this period felt strangely detached. They were both part of the release and outside it. They had already lived through the emotions being discussed. Now they watched others feel them for the first time. Interviews and appearances blurred together. Each question about acclaim or controversy reminded them of the harder questions they had asked themselves while filming. What it had cost, what it had taken from them. The audience's reaction became a mirror, reflecting experiences that were once private. The relief of success mingled with the discomfort of exposure. As the first days passed, patterns began to form. The initial audiences were smaller than for more conventional releases, but they stayed longer, thought longer, talked longer. Theaters reported that attendance built through word rather than advertising. What mattered was not volume, but depth. People came because someone they trusted had told them it was worth the wait. The trajectory was not explosive, but accumulating, like a tide pulling steadily higher with each wave. Inside the distribution offices, those watching the early results recognized the uniqueness of the curve. There was no rush of easy excitement, no sudden surge. Instead, there was a measured, steady rhythm. The audience's engagement deepened rather than expanded. Conversations around the film grew more serious, less about entertainment and more about confrontation, with grief, with memory, with the cost of endurance. The team realized that what they had made would not be a fleeting success. It would either last or vanish, but it would not pass lightly. The internal mood after the first weekend was one of cautious pride. They had not known what shape the reception would take, but now they sensed that it was strong enough to stand. The press described it as demanding, unflinching, even punishing, but also necessary. The contradictions suited it. Those who loved it did so completely. Those who resisted it still spoke of it with respect. The first weekend, once feared as judgment, became confirmation that the film's seriousness had found its audience. The cast and crew gathered informally in small groups, not for celebration, but for reflection. They remembered the nights on set when exhaustion made belief fragile, and now they spoke of strangers sitting in silence through the credits. It felt like balance restored, suffering repaid with recognition. Yet beneath the satisfaction was humility. They understood that this was only the beginning of the film's life, that reception could rise or fall with time. But the first signal was clear. The work had survived the world's indifference. It had reached people who did not expect to be reached. In the following weeks, momentum built not from hype, but from conversation. Viewers returned, some bringing others, some writing about what they had seen with rare sincerity. The word experience appeared more often than film. The trajectory was one of gradual solidification. Each screening deepened rather than widened the impact. The marketing team, once consumed by strategy, realized they no longer needed to sell it. The film was now carrying itself, powered by the very restraint that had once made it a risk. Inside the production company, the atmosphere shifted from anxiety to quiet respect. They had produced something that defied immediate measurement. The numbers trickled in slower than some expected, but the tone of coverage replaced the need for explanation. The film had become a reference point for seriousness in a landscape of distraction. It was not an event people attended. It was an experience they carried. The first weekend had set that tone, turning curiosity into reverence. For the director, the release was confirmation that patience had not been in vain. He avoided the spotlight, allowing the work to speak. The film's trajectory reflected his own method, slow, deliberate, cumulative. As more theaters joined, and as critics revisited their early impressions, he watched the growth with detachment, almost disbelief. He had not made a film designed for popularity, yet popularity found it through respect. The quiet victory of that realization carried more weight than applause. Among the financiers, relief replaced calculation. The risk they had carried for so long began to feel justified. Though returns were still uncertain, reputation had already delivered its own kind of profit. The film's name was now spoken with gravity, and gravity has a way of sustaining value over time. They knew that what began as a gamble had become a benchmark. The first weekend's modest numbers masked something deeper, a staying power that could not be charted but could be felt. The crew members, scattered across new projects, received the news through brief calls and late-night messages. Each update reopened memories of the set, the cold mornings, the relentless hours, the shared exhaustion. Hearing that audiences were responding to those same emotions transformed fatigue into pride. They had not simply made a film, they had endured one, and now others were enduring it too. That symmetry carried quiet satisfaction. Weeks passed, and the trajectory held. The film did not fade. Instead, it grew denser, gathering meaning with each retelling. The first weekend, which once loomed as verdict, became only prologue. The film's life unfolded slowly, mirroring the patience that had built it. The team learned that endurance, both in making and in receiving, was its defining element. Viewers continued to discover it, often years later, as if the film waited for the right time to be understood. For everyone who had been part of its creation, that trajectory confirmed something vital, that sincerity endures even when spectacle fades. The opening weekend had been a moment of collective vulnerability, a test of whether faith could survive exposure. It did. The film's reception was not a flash of triumph, but a steady affirmation. The world had recognized in it the same truth that had carried its makers through exhaustion, that what matters most cannot be rushed, and that meaning, once found, holds. Distribution followed a rhythm both expected and intimate, like the slow unwinding of a story already told but still unfinished. The film, once a private labor known only to its makers, now began its passage through the quiet machinery that connects creation to audience. This stage, though outwardly procedural, carried its own emotional current. The team had long since grown accustomed to uncertainty, but now they faced a different kind of waiting. The waiting for the film to be seen, shared, measured, and remade by those who had nothing to do with its making. The journey from studio to screen unfolded through layers, each with its own tempo. Contracts, clearances, and schedules formed the surface narrative, but beneath it ran a subtler one. The hope that the work would retain its soul as it passed through hands devoted less to art than to process. Every copy shipped, every screening arranged, was a test of preservation. The film had been built from faith and exhaustion, and the question now was whether it could endure the quiet abrasion of commerce without losing its gravity. The people managing its distribution felt this tension daily. Their tasks were simple in description, coordinate, deliver, account, but heavy in implication. They became custodians of tone, guardians of integrity in a system designed for efficiency. Every delay, every logistical snag carried more than practical weight. It carried the risk of erosion. The film's inner stillness could be dulled by overexposure, its depth flattened by repetition. The distributors knew that what they were handling was fragile in ways the paperwork did not describe. Within the company, there was a deliberate calm. Everyone understood that this was a film that traveled best through patience. It did not lend itself to saturation or speed. Instead, it moved from one screen to another with the unhurried confidence of something that knew its worth. The release pattern reflected this temperament. Smaller markets first, where conversation could grow without distortion. Then, gradually larger venues, festivals, and retrospectives. The distribution plan mirrored the film's structure, long stretches of quiet punctuated by moments of intensity. For the filmmakers, this phase was both relief and release. After years of holding every detail close, they now had to let the film belong to others. They watched as reels were packed, shipped, and unspooled in cities they might never visit. The first reports of projection quality, audience size, or technical issues reached them through intermediaries. Each note, whether of praise or complaint, reminded them that the film was alive, moving through spaces beyond their control. The precision with which it had been made was now at the mercy of projectionists, theaters, and timing. That loss of control was unsettling but also freeing. The system itself functioned like a series of quiet deductions. Fees, commissions, and percentages passed from one layer to the next. The producers, once immersed in the creative side, now studied invoices and remittances, tracing how each dollar divided and returned. It was the unglamorous reality of distribution, the steady chipping away that turns a collective effort into an array of small, delayed compensations. But there was no bitterness in this recognition. They had known from the start that this was part of the rhythm, that the path from creation to return would be neither linear nor swift. The cast, meanwhile, experienced distribution through fragments. A letter from abroad, a newspaper clipping, a photo of a foreign marquee, all reminders that something they once lived now existed in places they would never see. For them, the financial mechanics were abstract, but the emotional deduction was tangible. Their performances, given freely and intensely, now belonged to strangers. Each screening felt like a fragment of themselves being spent again. The idea that the film was circulating, touching lives quietly, felt like both reward and depletion. Inside the distribution offices, patience defined the culture. The staff tracked bookings, shipping logs, and returns, but they also tracked sentiment. They learned to read between lines, to gauge from sparse reports whether enthusiasm was building or waning. The process was not glamorous, but it was intimate. Each call to a theater manager, each delayed delivery, carried its own human texture. The work demanded steadiness more than brilliance, endurance more than vision. As months passed, the film moved through its expected course. Opening weeks, steady runs, then gradual retreat into select showings and late-night slots. The financial trail mirrored this arc, tapering as momentum slowed. Yet even as the numbers softened, the meaning intensified. The film's presence lingered longer than its projections. It became one of those works that travel beyond their immediate returns, carried by memory rather than marketing. Those involved in its distribution could sense this shift. The project had crossed from product to artifact. The deductions, percentages claimed, costs recouped, balances reconciled, were accepted without resentment. Everyone understood that these were the ordinary frictions of the business. The creative side had its storms. The financial side had its gravity. The real work was not in resisting them, but in enduring them with grace. Each step of the process required humility, accepting that art, once made, must pass through structures indifferent to its spirit. Yet those who believed in the film learned to see beauty even here, in the quiet professionalism of forms filed correctly, payments issued, prints returned. The machinery of distribution, when seen closely, was its own form of devotion. The public perception of the film began to diverge from its internal story. To audiences, it appeared as a finished entity, solid and certain. To those within, it remained fluid, caught in the slow motion of settlements and statements. There was a quiet irony in this. The more revered the film became, the longer its internal processes seemed to take. Success did not speed anything. It only magnified detail. The people handling its accounts learned to wait with the same patience the filmmakers had once used to shoot a scene. Eventually, as statements arrived and the financial picture clarified, calm replaced suspense. The film had done what it needed to do. It had found its audience, justified its risks, and earned its place. The money that filtered back through the system was secondary to the validation it represented. Each delayed payment, each small deduction, felt like proof that the film had lived, that it had passed through the world and left traces behind. The team accepted these traces with quiet pride. The process closed not with a single event, but with a long fading. One by one, accounts were settled, copies returned, correspondence filed away. Yet the feeling among those involved was not of ending, but of continuation. The film's real distribution was not in ledgers, but in memory. Every viewer who carried its weight forward became part of the unseen circulation that no contract could measure. In that sense, the financial deductions were balanced by emotional dividends. The film had given more than it took. The final understanding among the team was simple and human. This was how films live. They move outward through layers of translation, creative to logistical, emotional to procedural, until they belong everywhere and to no one. Each layer takes its portion. Each delay teaches patience. What remains at the end is not loss, but completion, the calm acknowledgement that creation must pass through process to endure. The film had survived every deduction, every delay, every small erosion, and still retained its essence. Its path through distribution had become a mirror of its own story, endurance, transformation, and the quiet dignity of things that last. Every film carries within it a network of silent understandings, unwritten promises that hold it together. This one was no exception. From the earliest days of its conception, it gathered around itself a group of people who agreed, without ever saying it aloud, to wait, to believe, and to share if fortune allowed. The commitments surrounding the project were not purely contractual. They were emotional currencies traded in trust. Everyone knew that payment, recognition, and reward would come later, if they came at all. The rhythm of the work demanded faith first, patience second, and proof last. Those at the center of the production understood that filmmaking is as much a waiting game as it is a creative one. Early on, the director promised intensity rather than comfort, honesty rather than ease. That promise extended beyond the screen, shaping how everyone approached their role. Crew members accepted long hours without complaint because they believed they were part of something rare. The actors endured exhaustion and confusion, knowing that their work would be treated with reverence. These were not promises written on paper. They were made in glances, in shared exhaustion, in the silent understanding that greatness required endurance. Financially, the structure was equally dependent on trust. Those who funded the project, did so knowing that returns would not come quickly. The film's themes of patience and consequence seemed to bleed into its production life. Supporters waited through delays, cost overruns, and uncertainty. Some lost faith and withdrew. Others stayed, tied not by optimism, but by obligation to the vision itself. To remain committed was to share in its eventual outcome, whatever that might be. Each participant accepted a form of deferred hope, a waiting that would define their memory of the experience more than any later payment ever could. As the project moved from filming to editing, promises evolved into endurance. Communication slowed. The world outside assumed progress. Inside, patience became routine. Those who had given their time and labor knew that their recognition would arrive after the film had spoken for itself. The rhythm of production had trained them for it. Long stretches of anticipation punctuated by brief bursts of certainty. Waiting was no longer frustration, it was identity. They waited not because they had to, but because they believed it was part of what they had agreed to. When the film finally reached the public, the culture of waiting continued in a new form. The cast and crew waited for word from audiences, from critics, from those who would decide what it all meant. The producers waited for returns, for statements, for confirmation that the risks had not been in vain. The financiers waited for distribution updates, settlements, and reports. The act of waiting had become universal, connecting everyone in the same suspended breath. The film's slow unfolding in the market mirrored its slow unfolding in life. Everything about it demanded time. For some, that waiting was painful. They had invested parts of themselves that could not be measured in currency. They remembered long nights and uncertain mornings, and now they watched as their work passed into the world with little immediate acknowledgement. But for others, waiting became a form of quiet pride. They understood that lasting things rarely arrive quickly. The film's own message, that survival requires patience, seemed to echo through every inbox and envelope that arrived weeks or months later than expected. The producers, who had carried the weight of coordination, found themselves in a familiar posture, balancing expectation against reality. They received statements showing deductions, delays, partial payments, each accompanied by explanations that felt both rational and endless. There was no drama, only the slow turning of administrative gears. Yet beneath those practicalities lived a sense of fulfillment. Each line on a statement was proof that the film existed beyond them now, functioning within the same world they had struggled to reach. Actors often occupy a strange position in this phase. They are visible to the world, but distant from its financial machinery. They appeared on magazine covers while their compensation wound its way through approvals and settlements. Some waited for residuals, others waited for clarity. Yet almost none of them measured their participation through income. Their reward had arrived earlier, in the form of completion. The experience had given them more than they expected and demanded even more in return. For many, that exchange felt fair. Among the financiers, waiting carried a different kind of weight. They tracked the film's life through reports that spoke in percentages and projections. They understood that final tallies would take time. Still, they read every update with a kind of reverence, as if scanning for signs of vindication. The money would return, slowly and incompletely, but the meaning of that return lay in proof rather than profit. The project had tested their willingness to believe in art without guarantee, and now its slow repayment became a meditation on faith rewarded at its own pace. The crew, meanwhile, experienced the post-release period as a long aftershock. Their lives had moved on to new jobs, new routines, yet the film's shadow followed them. Payment schedules, final adjustments, and acknowledgments trickled through months later. Each envelope or notice reopened the memory of the set, the exhaustion, the laughter, the quiet understanding that they had given part of themselves to something larger. For some, those delayed gestures of recognition were symbolic rather than significant, but they mattered all the same. They confirmed that their labor had not disappeared into silence. There's an unspoken hierarchy of waiting in cinema. The financiers wait for balance sheets, the producers for totals, the crew for wages, and the audience for meaning. This film blurred those boundaries. Everyone waited together in different ways for the same resolution. The audience, moved by its gravity, revisited it, keeping it alive. The cast and crew, sustained by memory, watched its reputation grow. The financiers, patient by necessity, saw prestige accumulate like delayed interest. Time became the great equalizer. Inside the production company, discussions about profit gradually turned into reflections on legacy. They realized that what they had shared was not a temporary collaboration, but a long-term bond. Even years later, when settlements finally arrived and accounts closed, the sense of connection persisted. The people who had carried the film through its most fragile stages felt linked by something beyond payment, a quiet fraternity of endurance. To have waited together was to have belonged together. Public perception of the film's success never reflected the long silence behind it. Audiences saw acclaim, awards, recognition. They did not see the months of patience required to make those outcomes visible. The participants, however, understood. They knew that each gesture of celebration carried beneath it layers of delay, correction, and reconciliation. Their gratitude came not from sudden reward, but from the slow arrival of completion. Every check that cleared, every acknowledgement printed, every thank you whispered years later felt like the settling of an invisible debt. Waiting eventually became memory. The sense of anxiety that once accompanied it dissolved, leaving behind calm recognition. The film had paid what it could in its own language. Those who had waited longest felt no bitterness, only closure. They saw that the film's endurance in the world was their true return. Its continued presence in conversation, in retrospectives, in classrooms and screenings. These were the dividends that mattered. The quiet patience they had practiced had not been wasted. It had become the very thing the film taught. When final statements arrived, they came without fanfare. Totals were modest, corrections routine. Yet the people who read them did so with care, aware that each figure represented more than accounting. These were the last traces of a shared journey. Some funds returned to investors, some bonuses to crew, but what lingered was understanding. The film had fulfilled its promises not through wealth, but through permanence. It had lasted long enough for every participant to see that their waiting had meaning. Years later, when the cast and crew crossed paths at events or reunions, conversations rarely touched on payment. They spoke instead of the feeling of having been part of something that demanded so much and gave back in kind. They remembered the shared silences, the fatigue, the uncertainty, and how those had become symbols of faith that outlasted them all. In those moments, they realized that the true currency of their work was not in numbers or recognition, but in endurance itself. The pattern that defined this project, commitment, waiting, and eventual quiet reward, became a kind of legend within their circles. It reminded everyone who heard it that cinema is built on deferred gratification, that behind every finished image lies a chain of patience. The participants and promises surrounding this film embodied that truth completely. They waited, they shared, they endured, and in the end, what they received was not just compensation but belonging, the rare peace of knowing that they had been part of something that asked for everything and gave something timeless in return. Relief did not arrive in a single moment. It seeped in gradually, like warmth returning after long cold. Those who had carried the film from conception to completion found that peace came in fragments. Letters received, accounts reconciled, acknowledgments spoken softly at the edges of new projects. The sense of cost that had hung over the production began to loosen. It was not forgotten, but it no longer hurt. The real relief was not financial. It was emotional, the quiet recognition that what had once consumed them had been worth it. In the early days after release, no one expected ease. Paperwork lingered, reports arrived late. Numbers drifted through the system with the same sluggishness that had defined every other stage of the journey. But somewhere within that familiar frustration, a shift occurred. Delays no longer felt like failures. They felt like echoes. The exhaustion that once clouded judgment gave way to perspective. People began to see the cost differently, not as debt, but as proof of what they had endured. When small residual payments or final settlements appeared, they carried symbolic weight far greater than their monetary value. Each one felt like a closing of a circle, a quiet nod from the universe acknowledging the work done. The producers, who had spent years calculating, adjusting, and waiting, experienced this phase as a kind of exhale. They had lived in constant tension, balancing creative demands against financial survival. Now, as the accounts settled, they discovered that the real victory was not in balance sheets, but in endurance itself. The relief they felt was slow and steady, arriving through realization rather than revelation. The film had not destroyed them. It had tested every threshold, but they had emerged with dignity intact. The weight of cost, once unbearable, now seemed a fair exchange for what the film had become. The cast felt a different form of relief. They had carried the film's emotional burden long after shooting ended, haunted by scenes that blurred the line between performance and memory. As years passed, and as audiences continued to speak of their work with reverence, that burden lightened. The film's continued life in the public imagination transformed fatigue into pride. They saw that what had once been suffering had become art, and that transformation was its own kind of healing. When interviews revisited the film, they spoke of it not with bitterness, but with a gentle detachment, as if describing a storm they had once survived together.